Next, actor Matt Dillon talks about his recent trip to Myanmar and the plight of the Rohingya people who live there. They're an ethnic Muslim community that has been stateless since a 1982 law denied them citizenship rights, causing most to live in camps that lack adequate food and health care. From the National Press Club, this is an hour.
Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Hughes. I'm an editor for Bloomberg First Word. That's our breaking news desk here in Washington. And I'm president of the National Press Club. Our guest today is actor and screenwriter Matt Dillon, who will be joined by Michelle Gabodon, president of Refugees International. But first, I want to introduce my colleague at Bloomberg News, Kasia Klimasinska, sitting to my left, and she is a Speakers Committee member who helped organize this event. Thank you so much, Kasia. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. You can follow the action on Twitter, and even though, as I said, it's not lunchtime, we are using the hashtag NPCLunch. So all of you out in Twitterland, the hashtag is NPCLunch. Now, you might remember Matt Dillon as the star of the Francis Ford Coppola film, The Outsiders. And if you do, you might say his appearance with us today is appropriate. 35 years into his acting career, Dillon is turning his attention and our attention to a group of people who are among the world's ultimate outsiders, the Rohingya Muslims of Myanmar. So Dillon recently visited Myanmar's Rakhine state, and he spent 2 days touring a refugee camp that tens of thousands of Rohingya Muslims call home. No country claims these people. The Rohingya have been stateless for centuries. They are descendants of people who lived in what is now Bangladesh. They are unwanted, both in the land of their distant ancestors and in Myanmar. This decade, the plight of the Rohingya turned from statelessness to persecution. Long simmering tensions between Burmese Buddhists and their poor Muslim neighbors have exploded into violence. Mobs armed with machetes have killed hundreds of Rohingya, prompting more than 100,000 to flee. Many thought they would find freedom through traffickers, who instead left them for dead, floating on rickety boats on the Andaman Sea, or buried in shallow graves in nearby Malaysia and Thailand. This level of gruesomeness and despair might tempt us to look away. But Matt Dillon is making it his mission to make sure that we do not look away. Speaking to the press after his recent visit to the Rohingya refugee camp, Dillon said, I quote, "No one should have to live like this. They are being strangled slowly. They have no hope for the future and nowhere to go." Dillon is no stranger to refugee issues. He sits on the board of Refugees International. Accompanying him here today is Michelle Gabodon. Gabodon has served as president of Refugees International since September 2010, and he works to help refugees and displaced people worldwide. Now, Dillon, when he is not helping refugees, has continued an acting career, and that career has included movies such as Beautiful Girls, a personal favorite of mine, Wild Things, There's Something About Mary, and City of Ghosts. He picked up an Oscar nomination for his role in Crash, which was selected as the Best Picture in 2006. Dillon is currently starring in M. Night Shyamalan's Fox miniseries, Wayward Pines. Please join me in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to Matt Dillon.
Thank you. I want to thank you. That was a very That was a lovely introduction, and I want to thank Kasia and everybody here at the National Press Club for hosting Michelle and myself. The Rohingya of Myanmar are currently the largest stateless ethnic group in the world, estimated somewhere over 100 million people. 1 million people. I get those numbers right. Million people. At least a million people. And having served on the board of Refugees International over the last 7 years, I've obviously heard about the Rohingya during that time. They've been a group of great concern for RI going as far back as the early 90s, maybe even longer. But it was 6 weeks ago here in D.C. that the Rohingya, really got my attention. Toon Kin, who's a human rights activist and an advocate for his fellow Rohingya, was being honored at Refugees International event, and he made a powerful speech. There was an urgency that you don't typically hear from somebody at an award ceremony. It was more of an immediate, desperate plea than someone who was accepting an award for something that they had done in the past. The first words out of his mouth were, "I don't exist." Now, I learned later that at the very moment that he was making that speech, many Rohingya were suffering, thousands, and dying at sea. My decision to go to Myanmar was a kind of a spontaneous thing. It wasn't something that I planned. I happened to be in Tokyo doing press for Wayward Pines, and at that time there was more stuff that was coming out about the Rohingya in the news. Pictures, horrendous pictures of people crammed into the holds of boats like human cargo. There's stories of human trafficking, as was mentioned earlier, and ships being turned away by countries in the region. And I wanted to find out a little bit more about why these people were being forced to flee. I'd been on mission before with Refugees International, and I'd met and spoke with displaced people in Eastern Congo and in the Sudan. And I really feel that the best way to learn about what's going on is to go there and see it for yourself. So I called Michelle and I told him, hey, I'm thinking about going to Burma to visit the camps, and what do you think? And he said, Matt, I think it would be very good, but it's not going to be easy, because he told me that a number of the NGOs working there, like MSF, had been chased out of the camps. It's never a good sign when MSF gets chased away. But he said, by all means, if you can go, do it. I think it can make a difference. And he said, make sure you take a lot of pictures. So I decided to go under the radar. I met up with a few journalist friends who were living in the region, who are more familiar with the crisis than I am. And we went to Sitwe together, which is the main city in the Rakhine State. As many of you might know, the Rohingya Muslims they're an ethnic minority in the Rakhine State. The vast majority of people living there are Buddhist, who are themselves an ethnic minority within the country of Myanmar. In the 2 days that we were there, we visited 4 displacement IDP camps. I was told, don't use, I'm not very good with acronyms, but once I get one, I like to use it, So, but we visited 4 displacement IDP camps and one Rohingya village near the coastline, just outside the main town of Sitwe. And many of the inhabitants there, many of the people living there were forced to live there after their homes were destroyed in outbursts of ethnic violence over the last 3 years. The first impression when you visit these camps right away is that nobody would live there if they had a choice. It's hot, dry, there's no trees. The people we met seemed to be thoroughly defeated. young men whose spirits were broken. You could see that in their eyes, you know. You'd shake hands with somebody and there was a politeness, but then they'd immediately look down, defeated. You know, there were signs of malnutrition among the children. We met people who tried to escape unsuccessfully and spent several horrific months at sea, starved and beaten, only to be returned for ransom. You know, they had to pay a ransom. Basically lost everything and ended up back in Myanmar. There were others whose homes had been burned to the ground and watched their neighbors being murdered as the police did nothing to stop it. During the 2 days that we were there, we didn't see any aid workers in the camps. I mean, there were signs that they were there. There were plenty of, you know, well-structured latrines and things like that. But yet we didn't really see anybody, and that was a little bit strange, because I've been in refugee camps before. It was the first time I didn't see anybody. And now I didn't visit all the camps, and again, I was only there for a few days. But from what I understand, the NGOs are not having an easy time working in the region. The health clinic in the community that we visited serviced about 30,000 people, with one doctor who comes 4 days a week for about 2 hours a day. So this is just not enough, obviously. It says a lot about the desire to help these people there. The conditions in the camps are bad, obviously not good. But from what I've been told, the situation in the northern Rakhine state is much worse, where the apartheid-like conditions are more blatant. It's getting less attention because it's not somewhere that you can visit easily. You have to go by boat, and again, the government really doesn't want you going there. And this is where 90% of the Rohingya live, and unlike the Sitwe region to the south, the population is almost entirely Rohingya. Yet they're forbidden to have administrative positions and are treated as second-class citizens. They're completely controlled by the police. I didn't get to go there. It's not easy to access. Back in Sitwe, the last Rohingya neighborhood in the town is called Ang Minglar. It's a neighborhood where no one is allowed to enter. The people living there are prisoners. You know, their economic life has been shut down. They have no access to services. If they want to get out, they have to pay a bribe. And in appearance, as you're driving through, it appears to be like other residential streets in the town, except there's barbed wire checkpoints. And we don't really know what's going on inside because it's forbidden to enter. I tried to enter the neighborhood knowing it was off limits, and I was stopped by a policeman who was really just a kid, and he insisted that I leave repeatedly. Now, he didn't want me taking pictures. And this went on for a little while, you know, him putting his hand in front of my camera and me sort of playing dumb and him telling me I have to go. And I got the point when, you know, a truck pulled up with more police with guns, so we left. Minglar is a neighborhood that it's blocked off, and it's literally like the Polish ghetto under the Nazis, you know, where people are contained, trapped. And this is an area of concern. You know, talking to Michelle and, you know, folks at Human Rights Watch, that this is an area of concern, that if the violence flares up again, as it has in the recent past, that this neighborhood, Ang Minglar, and its inhabitants, the Rohingya, will bear the brunt of the violence there. And that's a real concern. The people living there are trapped, and they'd be like sitting ducks where they are. So with all the news that's been out there about the Rohingya being turned away at sea, it's taken the heat off the Myanmar government, you know, and it's turned it more into an international issue. A few weeks ago, there were media reports that the Myanmar Navy had intercepted a ship holding 600 refugees off its shore. And the Navy then secretly offloaded all the Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, which that was the majority. There were 300 to 400 Rohingya refugees. They were offloaded in secrecy back in Myanmar. And then the ship, the Navy then escorted the remaining refugees to Bangladesh. These were Bangladeshi migrant workers. And when they arrived, they were able to prove to the international community, hey, look, that, you know, there are no refugees from Myanmar on the ship, you know. And it gave credence to their assertion that these refugees are Bengali, that they're not, you know, from Myanmar. And they don't use the word Rohingya. They don't acknowledge that exists. They were even praised by the State Department and the UN for the rescue. However, it didn't really hold water. It doesn't really hold the water because, for me, because I met and spoke to several people who were on that ship, including one Rohingya woman who was desperate to escape with her 4 children, who told us how men had boarded the ship at night and ordered everyone from Sitwe to get off the boat, and the Rohingya were brought to shore. And really, the fact is, I mean, well over 100,000 Rohingya have taken to the seas in a desperate attempt to escape the hopelessness of their lives in Myanmar. And that's indisputable. The woman with the 4 children told me that she would do it again if she could, despite of 3 months of misery while she waited out in the Bay of Bengal. Because what happens is the traffickers won't leave in the bigger ships until they're filled to the brim, you know. So that's when, you know, it's a horrible situation. Young people are tricked into coming on these ships, you know, promised a better life. And so she suffered like this out there, but she said she would do it again if she could. That's how desperate the situation is there. It's kind of mind-boggling. And the reason that this is happening and will continue to happen is because the Rohingya are stateless. And they're unrecognized by the government, the Myanmar government. And despite the fact that they have been born and raised there and been living there for many generations, longer than my descendants have been living in this country, in many cases. So in 1982, a law was enacted stripping the Rohingya of the right to citizenship, depriving them of basic services, healthcare, education, right to vote. There are clear signs of ethnic cleansing. The Rohingya aren't permitted to travel. They need to get permission to marry. A new law has just been passed requiring a gap of 3 years between childbirth, which maybe that's not such a bad thing, but it's not in this particular case. It's obviously an indication of ethnic cleansing, a way of controlling population. So coming from that source, it's a bad thing, you know. I mean, if people choose to do that, we learned that. And when I was in South Sudan, that was one of the things they try to encourage people, is when they're struggling in these camps and in these situations, it's hard enough to take care of one child, let alone. So I understand that, but this is not that. This is a different thing. This is ethnic cleansing, you know. And, you know, the feeling I was left with was one of oppression, that people being trapped, hopelessness with no options, you know. But in fact, it isn't a hopeless situation. Something can and must be done. And, you know, I look forward to, you know, hearing from Michelle on what can be done and your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good morning. Now, the boat crisis that has been widely reported upon is just the most visible and most recent manifestation of what has been a very long ordeal and dramatic ordeal for the Rohingya. And I'm very grateful that Matt went back to Myanmar in Sitwe to see where the problem really was, because the boat crisis has given the impression, which has been used by the Myanmar government, that this is an international crisis, which it is not, And when confronted with the accusation that the boat crisis was the result of persecution, they say, oh, this is a result of communal violence. And when we describe the conditions of the Rohingyas in Sittwe, obviously it is not communal violence. Any government that is faced with communal violence will seek mechanism of mitigation, of reconciliation, find compromise between the different communities, and this obviously is not happening. So your visit, Matt, I think was really important to give more profile to what is really happening there. I was myself there a year ago, and the only thing I can say is things are getting worse. The situation today is of total segregation of the Rohingya from the rest of the population. In the north, as Matt said, they cannot move out of their village without authorization from the local police station. In Sittwe and around Sittwe, they are locked in camps that are becoming increasingly like ghettos, where aid is given in an ad hoc manner. The NGOs have tremendous difficulties to get there. It puts them into the position where they have to beg the government to have more access. And as they beg the government for more access, of course, they tone down their criticism of what is unacceptable, which is the absolute detention in which these people are kept. We have talked about the restrictive policies. I mean, the government has enacted now an edict by which the word Rohingya is prohibited. They request the foreigners don't use that name and that the Rohingya cannot self-identify, and they would only consider looking at them if they describe themselves as Bengali, which is a sort of admission that they are not from the country. The laws on marriage, on children have been mentioned recently. The government has withdrawn from those Rohingyas who still had some documentation. They withdrew their documentation. And now they say, we are going to verify them. How do you verify people whom you despoiled of all their documents is something they have not told us. We have seen in the country also a tremendous spread of hate speech promoted by a radical group of monks, and that hate speech has been tolerated, I would say even abetted by the government. The monk who promotes that has been promoted as a defensor of the nation. There's been no attempt to counter that hate speech. That has spread well beyond the Rakhine state to create a sort of anti-Muslim hysteria in the country, and it has certainly comforted the most radical Rakhine politician into their attitude to sort of move the Rohingya out of their state. So the Rohingyas are faced now with permanent fear, and I remember talking to women who were just completely bland and saying, when is the next outburst of violence and are we going to survive it? Fear, no hope at all for their children to get a job, etc. The economy has been completely stalled. So the few who still had some homes in Sittwe were assigned at residence. They could not go out, they could not work. And what I've seen is that they are destroying their homes, putting the wood on the side and trying to sell the wood so they can move in the camps or take to the boats. So we are seeing a slow hemorrhage of the Rohingya people, which is tantamount, I fully agree, to a process of ethnic cleansing. And if you wanted proof for that, just remember that after the violence in 2012, the president told the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, you can resettle them all. So the president said, basically, take the 1 million people out of this country, which of course the High Commissioner refused, but it did state quite clearly what the government wants. So what can we do? It's going to be a long process because the relationship between the communities has been made so bad by this hate speech campaign and by the fact that the government has abetted that any process of reconciliation will be very long. Immediately what we want is unfettered humanitarian access to the people who are in the camps and to the people in the north so that their very basic living conditions are improved. They have access to health, to education, and to a minimum of activities that allow them to sustain their livelihood. But we also want, that cannot be the only objective, because if we only ask for humanitarian access, we ask for better treatment of people who are in detention. And of course, the international community cannot accept that. So we have at the same time to push for a reversion of the narrative that is promoted by the government and of countering the hate speech that is spreading out. That is going to take some time, but the government has to take the lead on that. And we need to have slowly a release of the interdiction of movement that the Rohingya has. Now, that's going to be difficult because for the time being, they are scared to get out of the camps because they know that if violence erupts against them, nobody will defend them. So you need to have strict instructions to police forces, to the military, that they have to protect the fundamental rights of whoever lives in this country. And eventually, we will have to move towards a process of reviewing the citizenship law and to reestablish full citizenship for these Rohingya. But that is going to take some time. It will require a lot of international pressure, and it will require sustained international pressure over the coming years. And one last word, perhaps, before we open for question, is that the Rakhine state is the second poorest state in the country. The Rakhines are themselves an ethnic minority, as Matt said, who had legitimate grievances against the central government. And if these are not addressed in a process of reconciliation, of course, that will never happen. So we will have at one point to start stopping seeing, they're all good here, all bad there, but say, how do we engage the Rakhine and reduce the impact that their more radical politicians have on their population? A long process. The US has been a leader in messaging the right thing to the government. I must say the diplomatic messaging to date has had no effect, and I think one of the challenges of the future is what are the next steps that can be considered to push the government into a much better attitude towards the Rohingya. And John, on these words, I would hand the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Michel. So we're going to start with some questions about Rohingya, and I think both of you will jump in on those, and then we're going to pivot toward the end with some questions that I've gotten about Matt and movies, television. So Matt, I wanted to first ask you, and you can just come up, what got you interested in this cause? That obviously there's so many causes you could devote your time to. Why this one?
Well, I guess the question is, the first one is refugees, Refugees International. That's one question, which is, that's a longer answer. I think with regards to the Rohingya, and we're all calling it Rohingya, but Rohingya is what I heard a lot when I was there, was this speech that was made by Tun Kin. And I remembered he spoke at the RI Gala, and it really was a very gripping speech that he made. And it was different because it was so immediate and there was such desperation there. And he came the next day and he addressed the board. And I remembered feeling like I'd like to help this guy somehow if we could. Not help him, but help his cause, the people there, because it just seems so desperate, and then there was a lot of stuff coming out in the media with these, these ships being turned away, the human trafficking, the mass graves, and I just thought, I was in the region, this was something that I wanted to do. The other question you asked about, Refugees International, it's a great organization. I'm really pleased to be a part of it. I've been on the board for 7 years, but, I've been working with them for longer.
And how did you get involved on the board in the first place?
Okay.
Like why?
Well, it was actually Richard Holbrooke introduced me to, the organization. After Robert De Niro introduced me to Richard Holbrooke, and I was trying. I wrote and directed a movie. I was trying to get Bob to do it, and it was set in Cambodia. And Richard was fascinated by this because he had spent time in the Foreign Service during the war, and he said, "You've got to come to one of our board, one of our events," and I did in New York, and I met a woman named Yvette Perpoli, who was an advocate, an amazing woman there, very, very inspiring individual, and so that's how I got interested in RI. I didn't join the board until some years later, but I always thought it was a powerful organization, and then unfortunately Yvette died in a horrible accident in Kosovo. Her truck went off a cliff. She was doing some work reuniting Kosovar refugees with their families there on a mission for Refugees International. And you know, and I was really heartbroken because I really love this woman. She was a great woman. So she kind of inspired me to kind of get involved, and I'm glad I did.
And this is for either of you, that or either or both. But is the ultimate solution with the Rohingya to keep pressure on the Myanmar government? In other words, is that the party that is in the best position to end this crisis? And is it really that should the Myanmar government be the focus?
I'll leave that to Michelle.
Yes, for many reasons. First, there are nobody knows exactly the number, but hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas in Bangladesh who does not recognize as theirs. They live on the border in miserable conditions, and the Bangladesh government does not want any international aid to help them. So nobody wants them. What we know is that they've lived in Myanmar, Burma for decades or centuries for some of them. There are all kind of different histories. And if you do accept that any country has the power to decide that there is a section of its population it doesn't want, what sort of precedent do you create on this world? I think it is the problem of Myanmar. I think it's going to be complicated and they have to be helped, but they cannot be helped if they don't change their narrative and their language about these people.
This is a question that was emailed into us. Myanmar is now a hotspot for international tourism. This is bringing in desperately needed development, hard currency, and revenue to the country. Why not hit them in the pocketbook and launch an international call for a tourism boycott until the persecution of the Rohingyas is fully ended and they are accepted into the full fabric of the country as vital, valued, and contributing members of Burmese society. And once and if this happens, then we hope tourists will flood into the country again. So what about that, some kind of tourism campaign like that? Does that make any sense? Anybody?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, I think any pressure that the international community can put on the Myanmar government to reinstate ultimately citizenship to these people, any pressure that can be put on the government to meet these people's human rights, and ultimately, change the stateless status and give them citizenship. I think it has to be done, and I think so. Pressure has to be put on them. I'm not so sure about that. Obviously, maybe Michelle. What do you think on that?
Well, since Myanmar has opened up, I mean, Western countries have tremendous interest in Myanmar. There are business interests, there are political interests, of course, and there are human rights and humanitarian considerations. I mean, so far, the pressure on Myanmar has been essentially applied by the U.S. government in diplomatic ways. And to be honest, whether it's the Undersecretary of State, President Obama, the Assistant Secretary of State for Migration and Refugees, the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, they all went there. They said the right things publicly, which means to me they probably say stronger things privately. So the messaging has been right, but the US has been pretty much alone. I mean, the European countries, the European Union, the UK have been pretty subdued in addressing the issue of the Rohingya. Now, if diplomatic pressure does not suffice, the next thing is, do you revert to, sanctions had been suspended, you come back with sanctions, etc. This is not for us to decide, but these are the tools that governments have. But of course, the US cannot be alone in addressing that. And right now, I think the urgency would be to have more governments prepared to at least toe the line that the US have had with Myanmar, which is one of engagement and discussion, not of ostracization, but with firmer and firmer tools at their disposal. Now, whether the tourism bloc is something that can be done or no. I think if it's not imposed by government, it's going to be very difficult to be imposed by companies individually.
This questioner says, it seems like the current crisis comes after Myanmar started some democratic reforms. Do you see any connection between the events? That's one question. And then the other question is the conflict based on religion? Are the Rohingyas Muslims living in a Buddhist country, and is that the root of much of the trouble?
Well, what is happening with the opening up of Burma, the process of democratization, is that the whole periphery of Burma, except the delta, is populated by ethnic groups, by minority groups, non-Burmans, if you want. All of them, or almost all of them, have had their issues with central government over the past decades. I think with the process of democratization, there is an aspiration by all these groups that they can have a better say in the political life and certainly better returns in the economical life of the country. Therefore, there has been more protests, more demands, and because the government has lowered some of the strong arm policies they had in the past, these manifestations have become stronger. So I think somehow it is a result of the process of democratization. But I would say what is not acceptable is the language that has been used against the Rohingya. Now, the fact that they are ethnically different, most of the other ethnic groups in Burma are of the Tibeto-Burman stock. The Rohingya are more of the Indo-Aryan stock, so there is a difference there. There is an ethnic difference. There is a difference in religion that may make the narrative more conflictive, but I think it's not good reason enough. I mean, lots of people tell you that in the past communities have lived pretty peacefully. There has been tensions in Rakhine State for a long time that have been stoked by politicians and by some of the history, but I think at the level of the villages, etc., there was a much better understanding. I think right now it's been used politically, and one of my fear is that the attempt of the government to try to pacify the Rakhine is done on the back of the Rohingya. And of course, this is a manipulation that should be denounced.
Matt, you're obviously taking your message to the press. Are you meeting with anyone else while you're in town? And you visited the situation a couple weeks ago. Do you have any plans to make any other visits or reach out to any other communities in working on this issue?
Not presently. No, not presently. I mean, we're actually, this is great to be able to carry the message here to the National Press Corps here, and we're trying to get the message out there because it is something that's been very difficult and vexing, and it has been sort of underreported. I mean, the Rohingya, it's something I've heard because I'm on the board of Refugees International. But until I heard Toon Kin speak, 6 weeks ago, I was, I had read reports of people's villages being burned to the ground, things like this, very disturbing. So I just want to get the message out there, and, what I saw, as far as meeting with anybody else, I know Refugees International, the people who are really better versed, frankly, in the crisis than I am, will be meeting with and have met with people on the Hill and things like that. So that is happening. I'm not doing it while I'm here because I have to get back to New York. Actually, we're going to do a few more, do a few more appearances to talk about this crisis.
Michelle, have you or your organization tried to reach out to Aung San Suu Kyi, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the opposition leader, and tried to encourage her to speak out on this issue?
Aung San Suu Kyi is the leader of the opposition. She's, of course, a Nobel Peace Prize. We did feel the question when she came to talk at UCIP a couple of years ago, which she essentially dodged. She has since then declared that she was primarily a politician, while the rest of the world sees her as a human rights advocate. So she declared herself. And of course, talking for the Rohingya is not going to earn you any votes in the current context in Burma. But I think right now, by talking too much about Aung San Suu Kyi, we divert the speech. We should talk about what the government should do, because it's the government that is responsible. She is not responsible for the policies. The government is responsible. We should address the issues with the government. If she gets into government, we'll talk about her then, perhaps.
This questioner says Myanmar has a long tradition of driving its ethnic minorities to become refugees. In fact, more than 100,000 refugees from Burma remain in refugee camps in Thailand, and some have been there for more than 30 years. Do you think the Thai government's experience with those refugees and their long stay in Thailand have made the Thai government more reluctant to respond to the Rohingya crisis?
All you, Michelle.
Well, you know, the Thais have received refugees in the hundreds of thousands since the Indo-Chinese crisis in the mid-70s. So I think they're a little bit worried to be seen as a sort of country where everybody can find refuge. So certainly it is a factor, perhaps, in their wariness about the current movement.
Matt, we had some questions about your career, and right now you're starring in Wayward Pines, which this questioner said seems kind of like a modern-day Twin Peaks. Is that a fair comparison? Why or why not? And what can you tell us about your feelings about Wayward Pines, how it's going and how it's being received?
Okay, on to Wayward Pines here. Well, you know, it was a really interesting experience because I hadn't done any long-form television before. It's funny because I was speaking to one of our board members from RI, and she was like, "It's like the Twilight Zone. It's not like Twin Peaks." And I kind of agree. I mean, I kind of felt the tone of it felt like the Twilight Zone when I was doing it. I could tell you it was an enjoyable experience, at times stressful and challenging for me. You know, sort of, I'm not crazy about surprises in the best of circumstances. And when you're doing television, you know, you're getting new scripts all the time. And so that can be a little bit tricky, you know, because I'm not one to, you know, if I have thoughts on something, I'm going to speak up. And I did. And it was good. And I think that's what makes the show good. It was an incredibly talented group of people, including the rest of the cast and the directors that would come on board. And so it really was it was a different environment in that way, I think, than typically on television. Yeah.
Matt, this questioner notes that it seems you have cut a different path than some of your contemporaries, as you've opted more toward indie picks than Hollywood blockbusters. Was that a conscious decision? And if so, why did you decide that?
Well, the industry's changed since I've been in the business several times. And I never consciously, I mean, indie picks didn't exist when I started in the movie business. I mean, of course they did, but not really. There wasn't this kind of, you know, indie film division with studio pictures. The first film I did would have been very much an indie film, you know, but it was in fact, you know, distributed by Warner Brothers, and it was backed by Orion with Warner Brothers. It would have been considered a studio picture as well. So I don't know. I just I tend to gravitate toward, you know, sometimes more character-driven material. You know, I just look for a good script. I look for a good character. Those are the things that I've always looked for.
You've now worked with a wide range of directors, so this questioner would like you to compare and contrast Francis Ford Coppola with M. Night Shyamalan.
Are we here to talk about the Rohingya? What's going on? Well, I don't like to. Comparisons are never valid, you know, and so I don't want to compare. I thought that Night Shyamalan was terrific working with him as a director. A very talented director with good leadership skills, and I enjoyed the experience. Yeah, I only wish he would have directed more than the first episode because I really enjoyed working with him. Obviously, I learned a lot from Francis. Any more questions about the Rohingya, about refugees? Okay.
I actually do. I also have some more movie questions. But how do you see the role of the UN in this crisis in China? And are there meetings with members of Congress? And maybe you can talk a little bit more about reaching out to the Hill, but also the role of the UN, China, other powerful political forces in addressing this crisis.
I think you should address that one. Thank you. You're excellent.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question about the UN in China is. This is a huge question. I mean, China is a permanent member of the Security Council, so it's a major influence over the political process in the UN, obviously. But on the Rohingya issue, I'm not quite sure where the question goes. I mean, perhaps I can anticipate some of the things we would like to see. I mean, given the level of persecution the Rohingya have followed and the fact that the government denies everything, we think one very useful mechanism to address that would be to have a UN Commission of Inquiry. This is how usually you respond to this sort of event. I am afraid that this would be vetoed by some of the important UN members, and I think that's your answer.
When conflicts arose in the past, particularly in Indochina, there have been historical efforts by refugees to find safe havens abroad, not only in neighboring countries, but also in Western counterparts such as the USA, Australia, and Canada. That being said, and taking into account the fact that many Southeast Asian countries have refused the Rohingya safe havens, what are your opinions on refugee policies in the Western world? Should it change to accommodate this crisis?
Well, I would just like to say, you know, I mean, Refugees International started in the Indochina conflict during that period of time, you know, with the boat people in Vietnam and also on the Thai-Cambodian border. And I think it's not fair to. I mean, I think it's difficult to say that Southeast Asian refugees were accepted and welcomed into the United States and other communities in Australia and places like that. It's I think what I was getting from the question is that shouldn't they in return accept the Rohingya? I think that in fact they're no longer part of those countries. So, you know, I don't know that we can. I think there's a kind of a disconnect. But I think the thing that's most troubling, and I will say about the Rohingya, is that it seems as if nobody wants them, you know, and they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. They're trapped, and it's just not any way for anybody to live, you know, to be. You know, they can't move internally. And when they've tried to flee on these boats, they've been turned away. And, you know, many of them have died at sea. I mean, when we came back from Sitwe, you know, there was a report in the Myanmar newspaper there that said there were like 700 some odd Bengali refugees that had been intercepted on a ship, and there were 50 people dead on the boat. So you can imagine what the conditions were like there. But again, it was Bengali. It was all about they were Bengali. There was no mention of Rohingya, obviously, because they don't use the word. And I know that eventually these Bengali refugees were moved to an island somewhere off the coast there. And the journalists tried to find out more of what was going on and were detained and had their photographs erased and stuff. So they still don't want you to find out what's going on. This stuff is continuing to go on, and it's really horrible. I just want to say that I think whatever pressure, I think that the answer is more pressure on the Myanmar government to change their policies with regards to the stateless Rohingya and giving them the same rights that everybody else has. And I think that is a good starting point, that their security, their human rights are being met.
This questioner is asking about some recent harrowing photos to emerge from the Rohingya refugee crisis that were exposed as frauds. And these photos were apparently pulled randomly from old pictures from other crises around the world. Do you know about this, and is this publicity over the fraudulent photos, is that doing any damage to get the message out about the Rohingya?
I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about it, but obviously that's, that doesn't do anything to diminish the fact that people are suffering in a human rights catastrophe that's happening over there in that part of the world. So if there's pictures that are circulating, so what? That doesn't diminish the fact that people are really suffering, and that there really are pictures that are harrowing of people suffering on these ships, and we've all seen them, and that those are, I think there are real pictures, So I just want to point that out,
So when you talk to the Rohingya, where do they want to go?
Like I said, that there was the one woman that we spoke to who was stuck on that ship for 3 months at a time. She was trying to reunite with her husband in Malaysia. She hadn't seen him for 7 years. I mean, that's what she said. I don't know. I mean, that's what she said, and I have no reason to think that she wasn't telling the truth. And she said that if she had the opportunity to do it again, she would, which I found that I couldn't believe that, after what she'd been through. She'd been beaten on the ship. If she stretched her legs, she was beaten. Her kids were crying the entire time. They were fed, a handful of rice per day and a cup of water. It was horrible conditions. So, I think they just want to go anywhere where they have a better shot, a better shot of living, I mean, one of the kids, we met these three kids that were tricked into going. Like I said, I just want to go back, and one of the things that was going on, I mean, a journalist told me like a couple years ago, the story would have been a Freedom Trail story, these Rohingya refugees fleeing and escaping, that in fact it was a good thing because they needed to get away from this oppressive situation. But as the stakes went up, and the price went up, and so then you had these brokers who were themselves in the camps are Rohingya, and the traffickers who were piloting these ships would not leave with their human cargo until it was filled up. So they would have to so they started to trick people and kidnap people and bring them onto the ships. So a lot of these people that a lot of the Rohingya who ended up on the ship were kind of tricked or forced into going there. And there were negotiations made in some cases to bring them back from their family, somehow meeting with people with some clout and community leaders there. And they were able to get them returned. But I really think people are desperate and they want to get away, and they're willing to risk their lives in this way. And it's really incredible. And it's a very grim situation. And yeah.
Okay, before I ask the final question, I have some housekeeping. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, and we fight for a free press worldwide. For more information on the club, visit our website, press.org. To donate to our nonprofit journalism institute, visit press.org/institute. I'd also like to remind you about some upcoming programs. Actor humanitarian Gary Sinise will discuss his advocacy for American servicemen and women at an NPC breakfast Tuesday, June 16th. And also on June 16th, the club will host a Newsmaker debate with experts on whether streetcars are an answer to America's transit problem or a pointless throwback. And Washington Capitals coach Barry Trotz will address the National Press Club luncheon on Wednesday, July 8th. I'd now like to present our guests with the traditional National Press Club mugs, very valuable remembrances of these sorts of events.
Now we got to put some coffee in.
And how about a round of applause for these two also, by the way. Now we have time for one question. In the time remaining, Matt, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's next for you. Wayward Pines, you're going to continue on that. Are you thinking about any more movies? What sorts of things are you thinking in your near future?
Well, in my near future, I'm not sure exactly what my next acting job is going to be. That's the plight of the actor, you know. Never sure where our next deployment is coming from, employment. However, I'm working on a documentary about Afro-Cuban music, about a guy, a Cuban scat singer named El Gran Feove. It's a project I've been working on for quite a while. Documentaries take a long time. And so that's what I'm doing. So I've been spending a lot of time really focused on that music, that world, that music. And so that's really what I have to finish this documentary for sure. And then I have a few other projects, film and television, different things that I'm developing. You know, I have written and directed, and I very much enjoy doing that. So I want to, you know, figure out what my next sort of fiction feature is going to be as a director. Thanks.
And Michelle, how about you? What's next for you in addressing this crisis? What do you plan as your next steps?
Well, the next step is to make sure we keep the issue alive. As I mentioned, I think this is going to require a lot of time. There is no quick fix for the Rohingya people, but if we think that the boat crisis is the only thing that will keep our attention. As soon as the boats stop going, we forget about them, then there will be no progress. So I hope that we can remember that the boat crisis is just an epiphenomenon on something much deeper that needs constant attention. As I said, we hope that other governments will come up, and that this government will keep on messaging what it has been doing to date. So we'll be strong in keeping on pushing. We'll return there. We'll keep on working with the network we have of Rohingya across the world to make sure that their voice doesn't die out.
I want to thank all of you for coming today, and I'd like to thank our National Press Club staff, including the Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event, the research and work that our Speakers Committee Chairman, Jerry Zrimsky, put in for this event. I appreciate very much. And remember, if you would like a copy of today's program, you can go to the website, press.org. You can also learn more about the Press Club at that same site and keep up to date on all of the upcoming programs. And to follow us on Twitter, follow Press Club DC. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.